Previously on American Godfathers, the Five Families.
In the 1930s, Lucky Luciano, he made the five families the rulers of the entire American Mafia.
Luciano established a code, a set of rules for the families to live by.
Omerta becomes the most pivotal rule. Never rat out your friends, never rat out your family, and you should be okay. But if you talk outside of that code of silence, you never know what might happen to you.
When they followed these rules, they won. But in the 1950s, a new generation began to challenge the old guard.
Joey Gallo is one of these larger-than-life gangsters, but he also has these ideas about the future of organized crime that are really going against the grain.
And their way of life started to fray.
Valachi is going to commit the greatest sin of a mobster, which is to break the code of Omerta.
First of all, I want revenge.
After Valachi does it, the floodgates are open for federal law enforcement to take advantage of people who are willing to break the code of Omerta.
What'd you get at? Nothing but misery. As you all understand, once you're in, you can't get out.
Joseph Valachi's decision to testify marked a time of change for the five families. A change in the way they were chased by investigators, a change in the way they were viewed by outsiders, and a change in the way they operated. Changes that would test them like never before.
In some ways, I would say that's the beginning of the end of the five families.
I'm not sure how to introduce my next guest. He's a businessman who leads a most colorful life. His name has been in the papers a great deal lately, and I just met him backstage, but I'm anxious to meet him further. Will you welcome, please, Mr. Joseph Colombo, Sr.
In the spring of 1971, Joseph Colombo was the reputed boss of one of New York's five mafia families, a title other men had held before. Yet, on this night, Colombo decided to go somewhere, do something no boss had done before. He was a guest on a late-night talk show.
I was wondering how you answer the people who constantly imply that you're associated with organized crime.
I would say it's distressing to all people. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that to associate anybody with organized crime and just label them or stigmatize them or guilt by association or guilt by innuendo is very unfair to anyone.
A mafia boss on a late-night show. Clearly, the five families were in a new era, but it was no accident. This was all a part of Joe Colombo's plan, a plan that started years earlier.
A great change is at hand. This is one country, and we owe ourselves a better country than that.
The 1960s is a tumultuous decade, to say the very least. There are all kinds of social movements taking place, principally the civil rights movement, where African Americans are demanding equality and full inclusion in American society. You have women, feminists, organizing for equality.
You also have the Vietnam War that's happening at this time. All of these things lead to a lot of Americans during this era no longer trusting the government.
At the same time, the five families, the core of the American Mafia, was in the midst of its own period of change. By 1963, 4 of the 5 original bosses were dead. And for the first time, one of New York's 5 families would be led by an American-born mafioso, Joseph Colombo.
In the early 60s, there was a deal where Joe Colombo, he was on a hit squad to go after Carlo Gambino. And rather than carry that out, he went and let Carlo know what was happening. And as a result of that, Joe Colombo was given the privilege of becoming boss. That's how he got it. Everybody thinks that we changed the names. It's the FBI that changes the names. We didn't call ourselves anything. They changed it from Profaci to Colombo.
Joseph Colombo, born and raised in South Brooklyn, Here, the Mafia wasn't just part of life, it was life. Colombo's father, Anthony, was a made man in the Profaci family. When Joe was 14, Anthony was found murdered in a car less than 2 miles from their home. By the time Joe was 40, he was a made man, a rising star in the Profaci family. He was feared, having killed at least a dozen men for the family. In 1961, when the Gallo brothers kidnapped a handful of Profaci's men, Joe Colombo was on their list. Trusted or feared, Colombo was the future. His close relationship to leaders on the commission like Carlo Gambino made him destined for the big time.
My father looked at Carlo like a father. Carlo Gambino was the most soft-spoken, gentleman, kind old man you ever met in your life. He had a European sense of chivalry. He was very unpretentious. They were men of few words. You knew their ethics, you knew their morals, you knew their sense of what was right and what was wrong.
Carlo Gambino was an old-school Don, a valuable mentor and a vital ally for Joe Colombo. But unlike his mentor and the Dons before him, Joe Colombo wasn't born in Sicily. He was born in America. And what's more American than putting a new twist on an old tradition? Joe Colombo had a new idea of what it meant to be a mob boss in New York City.
My name is Joe Colombo. I should be treated the same as anybody else.
Joe Colombo is just a much more sensible gangster. He's got a funeral parlor, he's got a car dealership. If someone wants to talk business and the cops show up, he's just saying, I'm just showing the guy a car. He's very business-oriented.
Joe Colombo was totally innovative about how he wanted to operate. He didn't escape from the media. He welcomed the media.
Mr. Colombo, people have described you as a man of wealth and power and everything. Will you tell us what you do and how you have earned your living?
I work very hard, and I work at many a job. Legitimately, hard, diligently.
Joe Colombo wants to take the Profaci family, now the Colombo family, to the modern age. No more of these sort of Sicilian ideas. We're going to run strictly on business.
Whatever I earn, I live to what I earn. You file an income tax just as I do. Every year. Never missed.
The reality is that Joe Colombo is still running these extortion rackets. His family is still involved in all of these traditional racketeering operations that the family has always participated in.
A lot of loan sharking, gambling, union activity. He, strangely enough, had his own gambling operation that he ran, which was very rare for the top guy. Usually their underlings are doing all that, but he actually ran it.
He was feared because of his past history of being a hitman, a murder-for-hire guy. He was very confident, as most hitmen are, always well-dressed, boastful.
And they have to make bosses for wherever they need scapegoats. I happen to be one of the scapegoats.
As Colombo rose in stature in the criminal underworld, investigators began to take note. Since Valachi's bombshell testimony back in 1963, law enforcement agencies were scrambling to put organized criminals behind bars. And who would be better to nail than the first American Don, Joe Colombo?
By the 1960s, the average American finally knows that the Mafia is real. There are organized crime groups of all ethnic groups across the United States, and that they really are affecting at least some aspects of American society.
Are you a member of any such organization? Yes, I am.
All of the federal focus on the Italian-American Mafia specifically does sort of give law enforcement this carte blanche to focus on Italian-American men. And even though there's mobsters of all ilks, there is this hyper-focus on the Italian-American Mafia.
The Justice Department began to send strike forces into various cities to attack organized crime. But many Italian-Americans began to protest that Italian-Americans were being singled out and that they were being harassed, that even their families had not escaped the prying of the FBI.
In the 1960s, Congress empowered the Justice Department, the FBI, federal law enforcement agencies to get court orders to authorize the electronic surveillance on telephones and placing bugs in premises where there were conversations about criminal activity ongoing.
Title III of the 1968 Crime Control Act allowed law enforcement to more aggressively surveil New York City's mob families, and the Colombo family in particular. Those around Colombo, like his underboss, Sonny Francis, were under constant watch.
My dad was the underboss of the Colombo family back in the 60s, a very powerful position.
This man is John Sonny Francis. Francis, who has been arrested countless times, was described as a rising young lieutenant in the Brooklyn Mafia and one of the most dangerous mobsters in the country.
And my dad was extremely high profile in terms of media attention, law enforcement investigations. And he was arrested several times, indicted several times in the state of New York. So we had law enforcement around us all the time. They all had cars parked around our house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
These women are the wives, sisters, and friends of the Colombo and Francis families. All of them claim the FBI is harassing their families.
Oh, you must be Joe Colombo's sister. Well, we want to get to your brother. Why? Why do you want to get to my brother? Well, we're going to put him away.
I grew up hating the police, hated law enforcement, hated the government. You know, I always saw them as harassing my dad, harassing my family.
We were all in a car. There were seven children, and they said, "Go ahead, Sonny, do something to me." And the other one pulled a gun out of his pocket and said, "Go ahead, because I'm dying to do it."
Taking pictures or walking into your job, disrupting your place of business.
They get me upset because they sit in front of my house. They bother my husband.
Disrespectful at wakes, weddings, name it, they did it.
There is no such thing as a mafia. I'm supposed to be the sister of the biggest mafia in New York. I don't know what the word means. People want to know this about Joe Colombo? No. What they want to know about Joe Colombo, he's gangster. He's connected with every dirty thing there is. We, the family, know he isn't.
You got to remember, this guy whacked out a lot of other mafia guys. That was his job. And the Colombo family was murder for hire. And he was hired by a lot of people, Gambino and others, to do those activities. He was a tough guy, and he was a fighter, and he wanted to fight back. And the investigative activity involving the Colombo family was pretty intense. They had a very strong squad, and it was a natural instinct. He saw the FBI coming at his family, and he fought back.
If there was one characteristic, one universal instinct of all men in the Mafia, it was to protect their families at all costs, to defend when necessary. Joe Colombo was no different. He realized early that the best defense was a good offense.
I say there's a conspiracy in this country against all Italian Americans. And I won't stop saying it until I feel that the father of our country treats us all like his children.
Mr. Colombo, are you a boss of the mafia? No, I am not. Is there a mafia? No, there is not.
By the early 1970s, America was in the midst of sweeping change. The new laws brought about by the Civil Rights Act were now in effect, and some Italian Americans figured it was now their turn to speak up and fight back against Italian American discrimination.
A lot of white ethnic groups, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, begin to dig into their histories and to say, well, we have a history too, we have culture too, and we also have suffered some level of discrimination. So Joseph Colombo sees what's happening in the 1960s and all this talk about rights and oppression and discrimination, and he realizes that there's an opportunity there.
He was so outraged at that period of time because the harassment tactics by the FBI were terrible. The final thing was that they had arrested my brother Joey unjustly. He was charged with interfering with interstate commerce. and he was arrested and facing 20 years. My father realized that it was a tactic to get to him because of his alleged stature within what they call Italian-American organized crime, and it was a tactic to hurt him.
Colombo made a big deal out of his son's arrest, and he claimed that the FBI was just picking on his son to get at him, and that they were picking on Italians in general. They were trying to portray all Italians as members of organized crime, which was not true. It was patently a false claim.
Well, my dad had been convicted on a federal case and sentenced to 50 years in prison, and I was devastated. But shortly after my dad went into prison in 1970, we got a call from Joe Colombo that his son had been arrested. And he said, we're not standing for FBI harassment anymore. We're going to be picketing the FBI building on 69th Street and 3rd Avenue.
Joe Colombo had organized a picket line around FBI headquarters in Manhattan.
So I was excited. I saw it as a way to help my dad. And I was probably the first day or second day I was on that line, picketing the FBI. They actually gave me a sign when I got there. My dad's a victim of FBI Gestapo tactics. He was framed and sentenced to 50 years. That's what it said. So I was happy to walk that line with Joe Colombo.
People started coming that knew us. The neighborhoods came to support, and you had a mass demonstration outside of 69th Street FBI headquarters.
It was several months. That line grew from 30 or 40 or 50 people the first day to several thousand. I mean, they had to close off the street. Before you knew it, everybody was joining in that picket line. The FBI was extremely distressed. They didn't like us out there. They were throwing water balloons out from the top floor of the building down onto the line.
Heidi, 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 ho! We get back to the FBI!
I was the night supervisor at the time. I worked a 12 to 8 shift, and I was in charge of the FBI office at that point. And I would go down in the morning. They usually came about 9 o'clock.
We would hear on the wiretaps sometime. The word went out, hey, it's 3:30, you gotta get down to 69th Street where the FBI office was.
And they'd be carrying this homemade signs, criticizing the FBI, saying that the FBI was picking on Italians, calling all Italians members of organized crime, which was absolutely not true. We had more FBI agents that were Italian than probably all of the Mafia people in the United States.
The committees and the hearings of people like Frank Costello and the rise of guys like Vito Genovese. All these names coming from Italian immigrant backgrounds are now affiliated with Mafia, affiliated with crime, affiliated with violence. We are sick and tired of being stereotyped as violent mafioso. That is not who we are. So it makes sense that with all of this civil rights activity happening, why wouldn't Colombo get involved in the fray as well?
We were basically viewed as greaseballs. They now had a sense of pride, which they didn't have before, and a sense of unity, and they looked to my father as their leader.
And so he founds an organization, the Italian-American Civil Rights League. And in 1970, he holds a rally at Columbus Circle, where there's a great big statue of Christopher Columbus, symbol of Italian-American heritage, and thousands of people show up. There are big speeches.
What we are doing here today, pledging allegiance to our country with a show of Italian-American solidarity.
Let us not forget that the Italian-American has been an asset to this country, that we built it with our backs brick by brick. We didn't steal it, we didn't burn it. Thank God that I was born of Italian birth. But today, this day belongs to you, the people. You are organized. You are one. No
Nobody could take you apart anymore! Come, what no Italian has overcome in this country. God bless you, and thank you!
And this goes really well. They start to draw in lots of members. By the end of the year, he says he has 45,000 dues-paying members across the country.
Nelson Rockefeller, who was then the governor of New York, became a supporter. And there were other politicians. Nobody wanted to stop them.
So for me, it was all about the league helping me get my father's conviction overturned. That's what I believed in. That's what I was there. As far as there was no mafia, I obviously knew there was.
This sort of message begins to steamroll. The governor's involved. All of a sudden, you got Frank Sinatra at Madison Square Garden for the Italian American Civil Rights League. This thing is huge. Mobster Joe Colombo, he's on the cover of Time magazine. And he's kind of positioned himself in the spirit of the times as a civil rights figure for Italian Americans.
And he also got the FBI and the Justice Department to never use the word mafia when they had a few indictments that they did. In fact, Colombo was so powerful that when the movie The Godfather was made, he made sure that the word mafia would never be used in it.
It was Lindsay's office that wouldn't give him the permits because the league was up in arms. What happened is Al Ruddy comes and meets my father at league headquarters and brings him a suitcase. They don't put this in the movie with $500,000, which is significant money in 1970, 71. Serious money. My father says, keep your money, bring the script. He says, I'll help you. As long as you don't put Mafia, Cosa Nostra, and try to make Italians look bad. And it was an immigrant story. It was a great story.
We have been in touch with the Italian American Civil Liberties Union. Civil rights, it is. We are going to delete any reference to Mafia and Cosa Nostra. We are working closely with your organization to get ultimately the result that I want, that Paramount wants, and that you all want.
It's interesting that these themes that are going on in American culture during the 60s are also finding voice in the underworld. Flip side, though, is that they want money. For a guy like Joe Colombo, it's like, let's start this league. I'm gonna be in charge of it. And I'm gonna send out this terrific message, but it's also a really good way to launder some profits.
The Colombos began using the league for purposes of extorting shopkeepers in Queens and Brooklyn, asking for donations to the Italian American Civil Rights League, and it ended up being an extortion type racket.
To the naked eye, Joe Colombo was a businessman, an organizer, a public figure. But beneath the surface, he continued to lead one of New York's most powerful crime families, and he was sworn to a code of secrecy, a code that, if threatened, could cost him his life. As Joe Colombo's public exposure increased, the other bosses looked on uneasily. At the time, Carlo Gambino was the most tenured and respected boss in New York. Gambino and his allies in the Lucchese family had enthusiastically supported Colombo's Civil Rights League in the beginning. But word on the street was that the bosses were having second thoughts, that all the publicity was doing more harm than good. But Colombo was unperturbed. By this point, Joseph Colombo had been boss of a mafia family for 7 years. He had come to power at the end of the Gallo-Profaci War, time of great conflict and uncertainty within the family. But he had successfully steadied the ship. It may have been his strong leadership qualities, or perhaps the fact that the family's biggest troublemaker, Joey Gallo, was stuck in jail. That was about to change, however. Crazy Joe would soon be back on the street, which meant trouble for Joe Colombo.
After becoming head of the family, Joe Colombo was outward, welcomed people, wanted publicity, but that was his undoing. Because eventually what happened to him was, with that Italian American Civil Rights League, he exposed himself, which a lot of bosses didn't want to do. You didn't go out there and address thousands of people because you realized there was always a crackpot or some enemy.
You get the sense that your Carlo Gambinos are kind of looking at Joe Colombo and they don't want publicity. And this guy's on, the cover of Time. I mean, it was bad enough when the Gallo brothers were plastered all over the tabloids. So you get the sense that a shrewd cat like Carlo Gambino is just like, what the hell is he doing? He's taking this thing too far. I mean, going and antagonizing the FBI will really probably only get you in trouble at the end.
There was a lot of dissent coming from the guys, but there was a lot of talk on the street that Joey was becoming too high profile. A lot of the guys within the family were upset that they were walking the line and that the FBI was noticing guys that probably had a lower profile prior to this. So everybody's complaining, hey, I'm on blast here, The FBI is watching our movements now. Where they didn't know us, they're knowing us now. And one time I went to see my dad in Leavenworth and he wanted me to stop hanging out at the League. He said, it's gonna put you in trouble. And I said, Dad, they're gonna help you. And he said, they're not gonna help me.
In early 1971, things were tense in the Colombo family. It didn't help that on April 11th, 1971, Joey Gallo was released from prison. It had been 10 years since Crazy Joe was down on President Street, and a lot had changed. His brother Larry had died, as had the old boss, Joe Profaci. But Joey Gallo was still a bull in a china shop with no respect for the rules, no respect for the code, and no respect for his new boss, Joe Colombo.
Joe Colombo's one big enemy was Crazy Joe Gallo. And Crazy Joe had also come from the same roots in South Brooklyn. They knew each other, and Crazy Joe really thought he deserved to be the head of the Profaci family when Profaci died, that he was really the one who had been a big earner. He'd done a lot of important things, including being involved in the assassination of Albert Anastasia. So here was an inbuilt rivalry that Colombo wasn't ready for. While in prison, Gallo was looking for reinforcements for his own group, and he knew he couldn't get it from Colombo. And he recruited a lot of black prisoners. And he told them, when you come out, go and see my brothers in South Brooklyn. So he was building up an army.
It's sort of an interesting thing because this is definitely a breach of etiquette to go into prison and to be actively courting friendships with people outside of the mafia.
When you're in prison, each ethnic group is going to look at the guy that the people in that group going to have the most respect for. If they can see themselves making money with that person, they're going to try to get in touch with them.
Joey Gallo, he does not like the shape that the Gallo brothers are in. Joey starts to think, you know what? If the black gangsters got organized, they could team up with us, the Gallo brothers. We would really be kings of the streets then. Now, this idea to the traditional mob establishment is just, why would you, partner with black gangsters? They don't see this happening at all. But Joe Gallo is, better or for worse, he's sort of an innovator in that sense, and he's willing to go there.
So he came home. Joey never acknowledged that Joe Colombo was going to be boss. So he refused him as boss. I don't care who made him boss, ain't happening.
And he demanded from Colombo that Colombo family pay him $100,000 that was owed to him. And then Colombo took a dollar bill out of his billfold and threw it at Gallo and said, here, this is all you're getting, and left the room.
The fact that Gallo is even willing to demand things and allude to a lack of respect for his leadership is very much outside of the code of the families. Even if you don't agree with your boss, you don't outright say it.
When Joey got home, he told him, we give them nothing and we take everything from now on. I want everything that was ours before, waterfront bars, restaurant, bootmaking, shalaking. I want it, that's it.
Joey Gallo, he thinks that the Gallo brothers are being disrespected by Joe Colombo. He hates the idea of this Italian-American Civil Rights League, thinks of it totally as a sham. And he starts ripping up these league posters that are required to be put on Red Hood turf. It's sort of like grease the pistols, the war's back on. It's June 28th, 1971. This is the second Italian-American Civil Rights League rally. All over Columbus Circle. You got cameras everywhere. People are coming in droves. They've got the little Italian-American Civil Rights League pins. They've got waving Italian flags. This is going to be a major turnout.
We had my outfit all picked out, red, white, green shorts, a hat, excited to go, sausage and peppers, Zeppelins, entertainment people, politicians.
So I wanted to be among the first getting there, so I was there early. My mother refused to come. As a matter of fact, she didn't want me to come. She said she had a dream that something bad was going to happen. She said, I don't want you going. And I said, Mom, I'm going.
While Joe Colombo and his league members prepared for their biggest rally yet, the Gallo crew down on President Street had other plans.
Joey Gallo and the Gallo faction were not interested in the political actions that Colombo was trying to push forward. This is not a world that they wanted to be a part of. They weren't going to go to this rally.
They made us go up into Court Street and go to a few stores and make sure they didn't close down for the day. Told them that Joey didn't want them closing for the day. And then the day of the rally, we were all in the clubs on President Street, just hanging around.
Back in Manhattan, Giuliano Schiozzi, a 22-year-old cop from the 14th Precinct, prepared for the day's events. He remembers it well.
I heard about it the morning of the actual event. So there's no advance notification given. You came to work and you were told you're attending this Italian-American Unity rally. I had heard through the grapevine, having Italians in my family, that Italians who worked for unions would not work that day. They were told to take the day off. Don't come to work that day. Go up to the rally.
So when the rally on that day, police were everywhere. We staked out a photo area on the 13th floor of the Gulf and Western building, looking right down on Columbus Circle. One of my squad mates had a camera, and I had binoculars. We're all watching.
It's a wild thing, it's a political rally, but it's a mob boss, and Joe Colombo is there, like always, front and center. He is just mixing with the people. He is talking to the media. He's talking to law enforcement. He's interacting with all of these people that traditionally the mob would have done anything to distance themselves from.
These were all peaceful people milling around. I thought it was benign, kick off with a few speeches, and a few rounds of applause, and that would be the end of it. We would be dismissed, and I'd go back to the precinct, and that would be the end of the day.
Somebody came and said, Joey wants to see you. So I went up on the stage, and he looked at me and he gave me some brochures to hand out near Central Park. And then he looked at me, and the last thing he said to me, he said, and Michael, this league is going to help your father. I walked 12 steps away, ready to go down the stairs, and that's when the shots fired out.
I hear what sounds like, to me, muted firecrackers. But people don't run from fireworks. People run from gunfire.
As Joseph Colombo is making his way through the crowd, a gunman approaches him and gets off 3 shots. Shoots him 3 times. Colombo collapses to the ground.
Please do not panic. Please, ladies and gentlemen, this is the type of thing you can't do.
The captains, get into your position. Keep your eyes open.
As I'm going towards the area where the gunshots are, I see a female with a medium-sized afro. with a camera, a tri-lens camera. She's running away. Where she ultimately ends up going, down the subway. Joe Colombo was on the ground. What appears to be 2 gunshot wounds to the back of his head. There was an individual holding a gun. Myself and other police officers now tackle this unknown person, take him to the ground, secure him, handcuff him. Mr. Johnson, I believe was his name.
I turn around and it's hysteria, and the only thing I heard was, Joey's been shot, Joey's been shot. And, you know, I didn't see him. He obviously went right down, and then boom, I heard another shot. And that's when they got Johnson.
Jerome Johnson was shot while being apprehended by the police.
The crowd was still gathering in New York's Columbus Circle for what was to be the mass rally of Italian Americans, when suddenly gunshots, a whole series of them, and Joe Colombo Sr., the principal organizer of this event, was lying on the ground badly wounded, shot in the head and bleeding profusely.
One was apparently killed.
One was killed. I don't know what happened to the other two. The girl was closest to the colored guy. She was here. I don't know what happened to her either.
Through the investigation, Jerome Johnson, black man, had press credentials, and he had a camera pouch on his belt. And he's taking Colombo's picture like that, put the camera down, pulled out his gun, and hit him 3 times in the head. Jerome Johnson was grabbed by the police and dragged down immediately. Meanwhile, as we later learned, Colombo bodyguard named Philip Chubby Rosillo crawled through the cop's legs, got his gun, and shot Jerome Johnson in the back and killed him. And get this, he got away. With 25 cops around it the whole time, he got away.
This fellow, Philip Rosillo, he crawled under the cops and he unloaded a .38 into Jerome Johnson's back and neck. Crawled out from under the cops. They never arrested him. Could never figure out why.
Police investigated him, but were never able to get enough to charge him. Murder's not a federal crime. And usually, and unfortunately, when our jurisdiction ends, quite often we have to back off.
What happened to the photographs?
Oh, we gave them all to the New York City Police Department, sure. And there was a female with Jerome Johnson, our photos showed. And I've thought many times since then, all you have to do is go to where Jerome Johnson lived and show photos of that. So I don't know what the police did, but to my knowledge, they never found out who she was.
I ask you in joining hands to utter a prayer with me for Joey.
With 3 rounds in his brain, Joe Colombo was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors scrambled to keep him alive.
Colombo is then taken to Roosevelt Hospital. And I was then sent to go to find out what's going on. We got there and they said he's in operation.
How many bullets?
3 in the brain.
3 in the brain?
Yes.
Is there any hope, doctor?
It's possible to say.
And 2 surgeons came out right next to me, and I heard him say, "We're out of B-negative blood." B-negative blood is had by about 1.5% of the population. I have B-negative blood. So I'm thinking, uh-oh, what do I do? I said, I have B-negative blood. They said, would you give it? I said, under these conditions. Nobody else needs to know about this. They agreed. I don't know what was said at the FBI headquarters in New York, but after I gave blood, I was brought back up to the office to the head of criminal investigations, who was my boss. He said, tell me what happened. I told him exactly what I just related. And I said, I don't want any publicity. I did, it's my blood. And person was dying.
His pupils were unreactive. He was more or less half dead. He's more or less reacting much better now than he did before.
With Joe Colombo on life support and his survival unlikely, word began to spread in the underworld.
Then when somebody came and told us that Joe Colombo got shot, a lot of scuttlebutt about, right away that it was a Gallo. What are we gonna do? Who are you gonna reach out to? Go get a gun? What are we gonna do? It was a lot of, chaos.
Now here's the big million-dollar question. Is Jerome Johnson just a lone nut like Lee Harvey Oswald, or is he part of a greater conspiracy? This is, of course, what the mob thinks. And if there's anyone who they can look at and say is responsible for hiring Jerome Johnson to kill Joe Colombo, it's Crazy Joe Gallo.
In New York City today, they are still trying to figure out who wanted Joe Colombo dead. Colombo is the alleged mafia figure identified by the federal government as a top man in Brooklyn crime circles, who has gained considerable notoriety as the organizer of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Colombo was shot yesterday at a league rally, and he remains in critical condition today.
Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb. When Joe Colombo was first brought to the hospital, there's really no clear idea of whether he will survive this hit. He's in a coma, and his biological family, as well as his crime family, as well as his activist family, are all sort of rushing to his side to be there and to give him their support and their prayers. There are vigils outside of Roosevelt Hospital for days praying that he will make it through.
Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
I mean, it was a horrible situation. It was a tragedy. It forever changed the life of my siblings, my mother, the family, the Italian people.
The shooting of Joe Colombo devastated family members, shocked the press, and left law enforcement with more questions than answers. Here's what was understood. The shooter, Jerome A. Johnson, a 24-year-old black man and graduate of New Brunswick High School, was an aspiring filmmaker and small-time crook. He had a rap sheet that cited arrests for grand larceny, attempted rape, and drug possession, and did a 2-year stint in prison from 1968 to 1970. When he got out, it was back to making movies, or trying to. And on June 28, 1971, he attended the rally with his Bolex camera, a rental, and an unknown female associate. Before the rally began, he fired 3 rounds into the head and neck of Joseph Colombo. Johnson was tackled instantly, subdued, and shot to death. We know what happened to him. We know what he did. We don't know why or who gave the orders. The street knew, or thought they knew. They knew Joey Gallo didn't like Joe Colombo. Joey Gallo had black friends, and they knew a black man killed Joe Colombo. Without any evidence stronger than that, a theory took hold.
Yesterday, a federal crime official said Colombo's assassin acted alone. Today, the New York Police Department disputed that theory and said it is the department's view that the shooting resulted from a power struggle in the underworld.
The story right away was that Jerome Johnson was set up by Joey Gallo because he made friends with a lot of the black guys in prison, and that somehow they set up this guy, Jerome Johnson, to do the hit. I mean, it kind of made sense. That was the talk. Nobody really knew, but that was the talk. And obviously it had to be investigated, but everybody pointed to Joe Gallo. Everybody.
Joey Gallo was suspect number 1. Yet another theory implicated a boss from a different family. Sure, Gallo still helped orchestrate, but the call to kill Joe Colombo came from even higher up the food chain. from the most respected boss, Don Carlo Gambino.
Carlo Gambino, regarded by the Justice Department as the boss of bosses. Gambino was said to have been Colombo's patron at one time, but then, say police officials, he and the Gallos became disenchanted with Colombo.
The theory behind the whole thing goes to an argument that Carlo Gambino had with Joe Colombo a couple weeks before. And what the argument was is that Gambino ordered Colombo up on the carpet and ordered him to cease and desist as far as the Italian-American Civil Rights League. He told him to stop it because it was hurting their mob business. Colombo called Gambino a traitor to the Italian cause, which obviously Gambino, born in Sicily, took a great umbrage of. It ended up, Colombo stormed out of the room. Before he did, he spit on the floor at the feet of Carlo Gambino, an ultimate act of disrespect.
Carlo Gambino did not like what Joe Colombo was doing, and he knows that Joey Gallo essentially feels the same way about Colombo that he does. And so the story goes that Gambino talks to Gallo, sort of hires him for the hit.
We believe Carlo Gambino used Gallo before in killings, the Anastasia killing, so it's logical.
And the guy that Gallo taps is this guy, Jerome Johnson. And there's proof that Johnson is, connecting with Gambino guys.
Shortly before the second rally at Columbus Circle, Jerome Johnson was spotted by the NYPD going into a social club in Queens run by the Gambino family. And that, again, is the potential tie-in with Gambino.
It seemed unfathomable to some that Carlo Gambino would order the slaying of Joe Colombo in such a public manner. Broad daylight, Columbus Circle, thousands of witnesses. But it wasn't entirely unprecedented. Bosses had been whacked in public before, and it would surely happen again. Whether Gambino was in cahoots with Gallo was never proven, but on the street, the word was that Crazy Joe had put Jerome Johnson up to the hit. And for those seeking revenge, there was never a doubt of who was behind it and what would come next. April 1972, 1 month after The Godfather premiered in theaters, and less than a year after Joe Colombo was shot in broad daylight, Joey Gallo had a problem. He knew what his perception was among those in the five families. He was nuts, crazy, a liability, and likely the man behind the killing of Joe Colombo.
Joey was always making trouble in that family. It just escalated after the Colombo shooting.
There's an open hit out on Joey Gallo after the Colombo hit. The Colombo family's gonna get revenge.
And the word was out that Gallo was gonna get hit. I mean, I heard that. And that's why they told me, again, afterwards, not to go down to Little Italy at all, because he was known to go down there quite a bit. They said, stay away from everybody. As a matter of fact, don't come into Brooklyn for a while, because they didn't know how far this was gonna go. You're on the Colombo side. And so whether he was at fault or not, he was going.
He knew that he was in danger. Revenge in one form or another was imminent. But at least on the surface, Joey Gallo didn't seem to care.
Everybody was telling Joey just to stay low, not to walk around so freely because we know there's open hit. And Joey said, no, they ain't got the balls to do it. That's exactly what his expression was. They ain't got the balls to do it.
So Joey Gallo's basically walking around the streets of New York. He's kind of the Walking Dead. At the same time, In the wake of the Godfather movies, he's become a celebrity because the Godfather's a hit. And all of a sudden, society types in New York City want to start hanging out with the real gangsters, especially a gangster who's as erudite and intelligent as Crazy Joe Gallo. Wow, these guys aren't really that bad. They're just on the other side of a system. So there's this sort of naive thinking in New York high society that makes Joey Gallo a bona fide celebrity.
Joey, would just disappear. He was running around the village, sightseeing, having coffee, talking to people. He would talk to anybody. He would just go up to you, hey, hello, hey, I'm Joey. He was very inquisitive that way and wanted to walk around and smell the roses, and have a drink. Walk around and do what he wanted. He wasn't afraid.
Now, the problem is that you can't really be a media celebrity like Joey Gallo and still be in the Mafia. They don't like that. He's gonna spill all the Mafia secrets, this guy, and he just put a hit out on Boss Colombo. They're gonna get him one way or another, and I think Joey Gallo starts to know this.
April 7th, 1972, Joe Gallo's 43rd birthday. Against the advice of his crew members, Crazy Joe threw a party for himself at the Copacabana, a who's who of entertainers and socialites. Gallo was traveling with a party of 5, his wife Sina, his stepdaughter Lisa, his sister Carmela, his bodyguard Pete the Greek, and Pete's girlfriend Edith. It was a big party, and news traveled fast among the wise guys out that night. Joey Gallo was a sitting duck.
Joey Gallo is celebrating his birthday. He's just recently married. He's with his new wife, his 10-year-old daughter, and they've got a huge night planned. Any other mobster at this point with all of the heat on him is probably gonna lay low, celebrate quietly at home, go out of town. Not Gallo. He goes to the Copacabana, very high profile, very easy to spot.
They had seen a show, and afterwards they went to Umberto's clam shop in Little Italy, 4:30 in the morning. A Colombo guy had to get permission to do something. A high official in the Colombo family gave the okay. And they went through the kitchen of the restaurant, and they just started shooting. Gallo got up, tried to get out of the Umberto's, crawled to the door, and got out to the street.
Staggers out and drops dead.
We got a call maybe 7:30, and he goes, they killed Joey.
At about 5:30 this morning, it's the best that we can determine at the moment, an unidentified male walked in the side door, fired some shots, and then ran from the premises. Joe Gallo is dead, DOA, at Beekman Downtown Hospital.
A man walked in from the back door, and he walked up the side of the table. He fired 3 shots. He hit Joe twice, and he hit his bodyguard, Pete the Greek, 1 time.
No one knew really nothing until Pete the Greek got out of hospital. Pete the Greek was bodyguarding Joe that night, and Pete got shot in the ass, got arrested, but he went to the hospital, made bail, and got called right down to President Street. Said, who shot Joey? Pete the Greek turned around and said, the Sonny Pinto did.
When you have that breakdown in the official rules of the Mafia, it's easier to let anything slide. Instead of doing something in a way that's not going to affect the family, this is now just commonplace. You can kill someone in front of their wife and child, and that's an accepted part of doing business with the mob. The period of the 1970s, the continued violence that we see in New York, in a lot of ways becomes the undoing of these traditional Mafia families.
It's quiet out here on President Street, Joey Gallo's turf. In fact, it's too quiet.
Joey Gallo was a hero out here. Speculation has it that his killing might start a gang war, if it hasn't already.
There was a sit-down afterwards, but they couldn't blame nobody. It was either go to war with the whole world, or you had to take it on the chin.
The funeral for Joe Gallo was a scene. The sister roared out on the church steps that New York City would run red with blood over what happened to her brother.
A lot of people were there. A lot of people were hurting. A lot of people were mad. Joey was loved in the neighborhood. He was very generous. He was liked, Joey.
What did Joey Gallo mean to this neighborhood?
He was a nice guy, as far as my point of view.
When you say he was a nice guy, did he do anything to help the neighborhood?
Oh, yeah, lots of it, what I've seen of it.
Did you like him?
Sure.
Why? What?
He's a good guy.
Why do you say he was a good guy?
He tried to help everybody around here.
The public reacted to the Joe Gallo murder. It's legendary, especially for a guy like him who lived his entire life trying to be a movie gangster. Joe Gallo becomes sort of a hero to the younger generation. They tell their dons to piss off when they don't like what they're being told. It just was this thing where there's no order in the ranks anymore. So in some ways, I would say that's the beginning of the end of the five families.
The killing of Joey Gallo marked the end of a chapter in the history of New York's five families. Gallo and Colombo had both reimagined what it meant to be an American gangster, and they were both killed for it. As much as a new wave of American mafiosos wanted to innovate and transform their criminal operation, they were still bound to their original code. A code that had no tolerance for individualism. A code that resisted publicity and fanfare. A code that continued to require absolute and unwavering silence. Omerta. The 1970s was a transformative time for the five families. By the middle of the decade, all five families would be led by men born not in Sicily, but in America. The old guard was getting old. Carlo Gambino, the most revered godfather of the time, died of natural causes in 1976. His cousin from Bensonhurst, Paul Castellano, became boss, a promotion that was not without controversy. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969 and was succeeded by Philip Lombardo of East Harlem. After the shooting of Joe Colombo, the Colombo family fell under the leadership of Carmine Persico of South Brooklyn. The death of Tommy Lucchese in 1967 led to Antonio "Tony Ducks" Corallo becoming boss of the Lucchese crew. And the Bonanos, well, after their don fled to Arizona, they'd been trying to figure that out. Another East Harlem-bred gangster, Carmine Galante, had his eyes on the throne, and the conditions in New York City could not have been more accommodating for his rise.
Certainly, people talk about the 1970s as when New York was going off the rails. New York lost almost 1 million people in the 1970s. Huge population decline.
White New Yorkers are leaving New York City for the suburbs, and they're taking with them their purchasing power and also their tax dollars. So by the mid-1970s, New York City, still a very expensive city to operate, is running out of money. The fiscal crisis of the mid-70s really puts New York City in a bind, and the city almost goes bankrupt.
All that meant that there was a lot of empty space and a lot of sort of general hopelessness. If you walk around the Lower East Side in that era, the number of empty buildings is amazing. You go look at a picture from Avenue B, Avenue C, and it's just entire streets of empty buildings with cinder blocks in the windows, over and over. Same in Harlem, same in big swaths of Brooklyn. And there were so many people out of work, so many people leaving, that you ended up with a city that really felt like its best days were behind it. And inevitably, that leads to opportunities for predatory criminal behavior. And the rise of drug culture, which was really destructive to the city fabric.
It was allegedly against commission rules to be involved in the drug trade. But since Joe Bonanno's meeting in Palermo in 1957, members of the Bonanno family had doubled down on the heroin trade. Carmine Galante, an associate of Bonanno who was at the infamous meeting, had spent the years after growing the family's international drug operation, and in the process had earned himself a reputation.
Well, Carmine Galante was a drug dealer. He was violent. He had a volatile temper.
Even by Mafia standards, he was considered particularly crazy, particularly ruthless. He is really interested in the drug trade. Galante has long-standing connections in Montreal. Quebec was a much easier way to move drugs into the United States than the New York ports. And so Carmine Galante sees that. He ramps up drug trafficking in a big way through that particular route in the 50s.
It created a lot of resentment with other families who thought he wasn't cutting them in, and at the same time, he was endangering the families by getting arrested a lot. He wasn't that careful. So Galante was always on the outside looking in.
Galante was arrested on narcotics charges in 1959 and convicted in 1962. He served 12 years of a 20-year sentence and was paroled in 1974. By the time he got out, his mentor, Joe Bonanno, had retired to Arizona, and the commission had chosen Philip Rusty Rastelli as the new boss. But Carmine Galante, he had other ideas.
Galante became the subject of a lot of media attention. He had been incarcerated since the 1950s, the result of a major narcotics investigation involving the Bonanno faction in Montreal. And he came back on the scene, and it was sort of amazing that he was able to have all this clout, spending almost 20 years in prison.
When he got out, the story was that he tried to assert himself as boss of the Bonanno family. He never really was boss, but he was given wide berth because people were wary of him because they knew about his volatility.
Galante came in and said, I'm taking over, throwing his weight around, even though he technically wasn't the boss of the family. He started acting as if he were the boss of the family, and the newspapers don't know who's the boss or who isn't the boss, but here's a guy who's saying he's the boss.
The federal investigators say Mr. Galante is the boss of organized crime in this country.
Would that be a correct characterization, the Godfather of the New York Mafia?
I don't think, from my experience, practically everything they've said is totally incorrect and inaccurate.
The commission had said no, that they had picked Rusty Rastelli, somebody they trusted and somebody they thought deserved the post. Galante wouldn't stand for this. It was obvious he was determined to create havoc.
With little local support in New York City, after more than a decade behind bars, Galante needed reinforcements. So he called on associates back home in Sicily to join him in New York, work as foot soldiers, help run his drug operation, and serve as bodyguards, henchmen. They had their own code name.
Zips is the colloquial term that the mobsters in the US call the Sicilian gangsters for hire. What was convenient about the Zips is that they didn't have a profile in the United States. They weren't really known by the FBI or by the DEA. So they were more easily controlled in a lot of ways. The Zips were hired hands that were brought in from Sicily to help with the dirtier aspects of the drug trade.
Galante was bringing in those so-called Zips, these recruits from Sicily, because he had no real following in America with the 5 families in the New York area.
Cesar Benventri and Baldo Amato, who they describe as henchmen for the crime family Galante headed.
First time I met Galante, he was very serious. No big smiles, no big hellos. He had those two bodyguards with him both times. Greaseball, old style, old school.
His reputation is one of being totally ruthless and vicious. Of course, that is by reputation, and it may or may not be one that he chooses to embellish upon himself. He may enjoy that reputation. It may make dealing with his competition a lot easier.
He wanted to be the boss, and he had that old school mentality. He was making tons of money in dope, so he's powerful, and he was a real tough guy.
Carmine Galante's return to New York City and ruthless pursuit of power took the underworld by storm. He became a priority for law enforcement and a regular on the nightly news, often within an arm's length of his lawyer.
Sit down.
I'm gonna leave in the morning. Going to the country.
Good. What are you going to do when you get to the country?
Well, I mean, I planted peppers last week, now I'm gonna plant tomatoes.
You think that had an influence on the federal judge when he held that you were right and the parole commission was wrong?
I think so.
He thinks a farmer ought to be able to seed, right?
I think so. I mean, it's very well known that that's what I do.
But most of all, he was becoming a problem for the commission. A problem that sooner or later would have to be dealt with.
The U.S. government estimates that there were about 50,000 heroin addicts in America in 1959. By the 1970s, there are 500,000, and the number is soaring. There's two things that happen to make the heroin epidemic a real problem. One is the Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers are going to go over to Vietnam, where heroin is cheap, it's available, and many of them are going to get hooked. One study of the U.S. military from the early 1970s estimated that 10 to 15% of American soldiers were hooked on heroin. And the second thing that happens is the supply, through these mafia connections, flooding the streets of New York City.
My estimation is that I am seizing approximately 7 to 10% of the heroin that's smuggled through the port of New York. 92% is getting by.
The heroin trafficking, which is attributed to organized crime, has a ready market all over the metropolitan area.
40% of all the addicts in the United States, heroin addicts, are located here right in the city of New York, which gives you 40% of the consumer market.
In public, mafia leaders fiercely denied any involvement in the drug trade. Joe Bonanno would famously swear years later that he had no knowledge of the family's drug operation.
Now let me understand. If anybody dealt in narcotics from the Bonanno family, they did it without your knowledge?
Without my knowledge, no question about it.
You swear it?
I swear it before God.
But this was far from the truth.
We have guys going on record like Joe Bonanno saying, "We don't deal drugs, we're not a part of the trade." The evidence points to that being entirely false.
The rule was that you're not supposed to get caught. And if you got caught, that was trouble. But, you know, it was like a question of a sculpted ignorance. Like the bosses didn't want to know if you're involved. They would take the money. They could say, oh, I didn't know where it was from. But everybody would know that drugs were a key feeder for organized crime's coffers.
Half of them say, you can't do it. The other half say you can't do it. And both halves take the envelope. So, I don't know, smoke and mirrors, man.
Carmine Galante had no problem breaking the rules. He'd been trafficking heroin for decades and had paid the price for it with lengthy prison sentences. Now back in New York City and under the microscope of law enforcement and the commission, Galante employed his Sicilian muscle, Zips, to run the bulk of his operation. He wasn't alone in this kind of subterfuge. Mob leaders throughout the Mafia had taken it a step further, frequently hiring members of other gangs to do their dirty work.
The Italian Mafia, after some very hard lessons early in which some of their members were convicted, they tried to do more insulating practices. So for the most part, the Mafia wasn't doing street deals. So they instead were relying on Black organized crime figures for a number of reasons. First of all, reduce their exposure to actually being caught. If they could be caught, it gave them some deniability. And also, it wasn't easy for some Italian guy to walk into Black Harlem and start dealing drugs. You sort of had to be part of the community in some ways to get away with it and to not be reported.
I was born May 31st, 1951, in Harlem Hospital. I went to Catholic school, so I was with a lot of Italians. I knew people that were seeing people, and I wouldn't be able to say the names. I wouldn't be able to say who. I just knew that people were seeing guys considered organized crime that had access to getting them good quality drugs, and they formed an alliance. You got to realize they were legitimately organized crime, and they took over the docks, and they had the truckers. So they can move things around in massive levels that, most ethnic groups, they didn't have that kind of organization. Organized crime had generations to develop, information and instruction to pass down, where in the inner communities where I come from, the heads keep getting chopped off. When I was growing up in Harlem, there was adults coming from everywhere to buy drugs so they could either use it and maybe come back to their neighborhoods and sell it. It could be from Maryland, D.C., not just Long Island or Connecticut or the Bronx. Or that area in Harlem was an open-air drug market where the highest quality drugs for the lowest price was being distributed.
Through the 1970s, the Mafia made a fortune moving mass amounts of heroin into New York City. At the top of the list of earners was Carmine Galante. But it wasn't the drugs explicitly that put him in danger. It was greed.
If one were a mob boss, I think high up on the list of things not to do was to be too greedy in what you're collecting from your underlings. That would be high on the list. Talking to the media, become a media figure is very bad, that all of a sudden you get an expiration date from the other gangsters then. Above all, don't make yourself vulnerable to snakes in the family, because they will come back and bite you.
In 1975, Carmine Galante, a.k.a. The Cigar, and his crew of Sicilians had the Bonanno family in disarray. The rightful boss, Rusty Rastelli, had the backing of the commission, but legal troubles made it difficult for him to run a family with a disruptor in its ranks. He needed a solution, quickly.
Phil Rastelli wasn't a very good boss in the sense that he would constantly get into trouble, constantly get indicted, and constantly get sent to prison.
Prosecutors have filed an unprecedented civil suit against a mafia family, the Bonanno mob.
The Bonanno crime family, which has existed for some 50 years and engaged in everything from bootlegging to loan sharking to murder to robbery to hijacking.
His time on the street was rather limited, so he had to work as a boss through emissaries who would communicate with him in prison.
In the mid-70s, one of Rastelli's closest and most trusted confidants emerged from a surprising place.
Joe Massino was a working man. He grew up in a poor family environment. Nothing special. Money became always an object.
Joe Messina, back in the early 70s, ran a coffee truck. He sold bagels, he sold sandwiches, and he was a legitimate guy. But at the same time, ran numbers and took bets while he was on his coffee delivery. That's why he had the nickname Joey Bagels. That's how he got started.
Massino had first met Rastelli through his nephew in the late 50s. They were neighborhood guys, and through Massino's lunch wagon business, the two grew closer.
Rusty took a real liking to Joe Messina as perhaps heir apparent to himself within the Bonanno family. Joey became infamous, so to speak.
Joe Messina would go to see Rastelli wherever he was in prison, be it Lewisburg or wherever else. It was quite clear, it was well known in law enforcement that he was visiting Rastelli.
They were very close, very buddy-buddy, and Rastelli, in effect, used to pass out whatever information he wanted to run the family when he was in prison through Joe Messina.
Information would flow two ways. Messina would send messages to the street on Rastelli's behalf while keeping the boss informed with the latest family news. And there was a lot to report. Carmine Galante was becoming a problem.
If you're not the boss, you don't get to decide how much of your individual earnings you get. It may even be, on paper, your business, but the earnings are split up. You gotta pay your tax up. There's not a sense that you hold on to your individual money, and a lot of Galante's organizational challenges come from the fact that he was selfish about his earnings.
Rastelli knew that in order to maintain his position as boss of the family, he needed to make a move. So with the help of Joe Messina, he sought approval from the commission to strike.
Joe Messina's role was transmitting word and approval from Rastelli to the street. The Sicilian faction, which had been loyal to Galante, basically was turned against him. Joe played a role to help set him up.
I just think that Rusty had a little more guys on his end of the crew, and then basically that was it. They got to the Zip guys, bodyguards, and they said to me, and they grabbed him and said, "You don't walk away, you're gonna die with him." He knew he was in trouble already. But he thought he was strong because he had the Zip guys with him, and he thought they were strong, and they wound up giving him in a minute. They gave him up.
There's an old saying in a mob that it's only if friends can hurt you. And in this case of Galante, that's what happened.
I heard a job come over the radio, reports of shots fired, 205 Knickerbocker, I think it was. Possibly 3 people wounded or killed. So I take off, and I was the first detective getting there. Speaking to the wife first. She says, "My husband hasn't come out. Carmine? She says, "Yeah, Carmine Galante." So when I walk back there, and I see Galante with the cigar hanging out of his mouth. There was 3 people dead and 1 other wounded. When I pulled up, I was the only cop car there at first. An hour later, the street was jammed with cars and all kinds of photographers and reporters. Complete insanity, you know.
The killers came in 2 cars, the 3 triggermen rushing inside, ski masks over their faces. The owner's son saw the killers advancing, shouted a warning, "Watch out," but a second wave of 2 gunmen, also masked, entered and shot and wounded the son.
The 2 gentlemen inside died as a result of multiple gunshot and shotgun wounds.
Because of television, the information gets out to the public right away, but it also gets out to all the wise guys. So if you publicize all the information you know about the criminals, everybody knows.
For the neighborhood, the passing of Carmine Galante meant a lot of excitement. Hundreds of people took to the streets of this Brooklyn block trying to catch a glimpse.
Yeah, when the Galante hit happened, I was kind of shocked, and so was a lot of people on the street. A lot of talk about it. Again, not a lot of chatter, but just, wow, that was unexpected. Wonder what's going to happen now.
For organized crime, it means the beginning of something new, a new struggle for control at the top of New York's 5 families.
As one police mafia expert put it, a contract was fulfilled this afternoon. On the receiving end of that contract was one of the top mafia chiefs in the nation, perhaps the boss of all the bosses, Carmine Galante.
The murder of Carmine Galante temporarily restored order in the Bonanno family. Rusty Rastelli kept his seat as boss. The commission was relieved. The man to thank was Joe Massino. Massino's orchestration of the Galante murder put him in the good graces of the commission, and Joey Bagels began making allies in other families. One of the strongest families at the time, the Gambinos, led by Paul Castellano, had an up-and-comer in their ranks, John Gotti. In the early 80s, Gotti and Massino both lived in the Howard Beach section of Queens. They were around the same age, and they'd help one another when they could to keep order in their respective families.
Well, Gotti and Massino were friends, and they helped each other way they could. The one instance in particular, about 1980, 81.
Less than 2 years after a power grab was squashed in the Bonanno family, another one was underway. 3 Bonanno captains wanted Rastelli out. They'd need the commission's approval, however, and they'd never get it without the support of the family's powerful underboss, Joe Massino. Massino remained loyal to Rastelli, loyal to his oath, so he once again was tasked with taking care of internal politics.
The 3 captains, in Delicato, Philip Giacone, and Dominic Trinchera, were buying guns and weapons, and that was seen as a sign that the 3 captains were going to make a move. Massino put together a counter move. He went to the other crime families, and they seemed to say, look, you got to do what you got to do to protect yourself.
I heard there was a fraction going on. They wanted to take over the family. They wound up with a meeting, and it was held, if I remember correct, in Sammy Gravano's club.
Sammy the Bull Gravano was a member of John Gotti's crew. He had a club on 13th Avenue down in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood known as Dyker Heights. And for one evening in May of 1981, he lent it to Gotti's friend Joe Massino, who had some business to take care of.
So these 3 guys, when they walk in, somebody, I guess it was Joe, but the signal was he put his hand through his hair. They came out of the closet and started shooting. And they shot the 3 of them.
Massino's people took care of the homicide. Gotti's people dumped the bodies in the hole, that part of Brooklyn and Queens, which became known as a mob burial ground.
The Gambinos wound up burying the 3 guys. And one guy's arm was found out of the ground, but that was done on purpose, from my understanding. Paul Castellano was the boss of the Gambino. Paul wanted people to know that body would be found. This is what happens to people that look to take over a family.
The murder of the 3 captains sent a message to the 5 families. This is how an unapproved coup will be dealt with. But word also got around of who had pulled it off. Joe Massino was getting a reputation in the criminal underworld. He had successfully maneuvered 2 power struggles in his own family. But internal power struggles were nothing new. The next threat to face the Bonannos would be something new entirely. A threat that would strike fear like never before among the leaders of New York's 5 families.
After the 3 captain murders, it was revealed that an FBI agent had infiltrated the Bonanno crime family.
This man, known as Donnie Brasco, small-time jewel thief. Now testifying at a federal trial in New York, Brasco has revealed his true name, Joseph Pistone, agent of the FBI, who went undercover to infiltrate the mob for 6 years.
It was a disaster for the Bonanno family. Probably the biggest thing was the Bonannos were forced to forfeit their seat on the commission for letting this guy infiltrate the family.
Pistone was dealing with Bonanno family, but he had information about other families too. The feeling is, what other shoe's going to drop?
On the next episode of American Godfathers, The Five Families, the U.S. government delivers a blow like never before to the American Mafia.
The commission case is a watershed moment in battling organized crime.
All the bosses went to prison.
And as the walls begin to come in on the Five Families, the Dapper Don takes the streets of New York City.
John Gotti showed up at the right time in New York.
He became a star.
Joe Massino emerges as public enemy #1.
The only true boss of the Five Families who's out on the street with power is Joey Messina.
But by this time, the playing field had changed entirely.
If somebody was in jail and nobody knew where that person was probably cooperating and additional charges were coming.
Joe, the guys right now, there's an open door for rats.
I think the guys do the arithmetic, and they realize you're going to spend the rest of your days in jail. What for? Omerta is eroded.